Hello and welcome. We are live. This is Fort Roos News Radio streaming podcast coming at you live from Belgrade, Serbia. What we are talking about today in issue number 1, volume 1, is Israel's strategic collapse. We're going to be looking at how Putin sandbagged Netanyahu. Now, of course, everyone knows that what we have right now is this big conflict in Syria, and everyone's been following it very closely through Fort Roos News knows that an alliance of countries some years ago, going on 6 years, lined up and invaded Syria. This is something that has caught the attention of millions, maybe billions of people worldwide who have followed these developments very closely. Now, what we've had in the course of these developments is Israel buckle under pressure. What we've seen the United States lose its influence and stature in the Middle East region. That has been explosive. That has been something which was not expected to happen. And this has led towards a real and genuine realignment. Now, this is something that lots of people have been following closely, like we said, but others still have been receiving a new stream of information which is a bit confusing with regard to the relationship that the states Israel and Russia have and what their line is on Syria, how this works and what is going to be working out here. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. We are live. And this is an interesting article. I penned this one myself, but we'll be looking at other articles in the future by many of our different contributors. And this particular article, what I do is I explore the ins and outs of Israel's strategic collapse. Now, this is, of course, not meant to be exhaustive. It's not a book. It's not a series of books, but it is a single article. But I think that people who've been following this story, many of the facts will jump out at them right away, and they'll begin to understand what is at stake and what has happened. So basically, what we know is that about a week ago, Russia declared that it would be establishing 8 militarized outposts along the de facto Israel-Syria border. Now, we say de facto because, in fact, it's all Syria, and this border area is where the Golan Heights is, which is also Syria, but has been under Israeli occupation for the good part of the last 51 years. And for 51 years, it's been under Israeli occupation, and in the early 80s, they declared it annexed. Now, the UN issued UN Security Council resolution, might have been 1244. At any rate, this one is an important one because it lays out the foundation for the illegal nature of the Israeli occupation and annexation of the Golan Heights. You can literally look at a map today and see the area that is occupied Syria. We're not talking about Palestine here, folks. We're talking about Syria. That Israel's also occupying a part of Syria, the Golan Heights. And they've gone in, of course, and they've renamed whole large parts of it. They have renamed whole large areas of Palestine. And also, looking at the Golan Heights, you will see that they have renamed towns and historical places and given them Hebrew names. Hebrew is, as you know, a dead language that was kept alive by the rabbinical priestly caste of the Jewish faith. And how it was pronounced or how it was spoken is an oral tradition of a priestly caste, and a broken one at that. So there's really no good sense of what Hebrew may have sounded like in the past. We know how it's spoken today as a revived, I almost said religion. It's also a revived religion, but as a revived language. So looking at Israel's position now, it is a very sensitive position because they had placed most of their eggs in the American basket. And now people, of course, are right to point out when they say that don't Israelis also have significant influence in Russia. And we'll look at that. There's a lot of dual citizens. They happen to be Jewish, but that's not what's important, right? And what we will be looking at then is how the UN responded to Russia, how the US has seen its influence wane, and what Israel has tried to do, what they have done, and what Russia was able to do to sandbag Israel. Basically, this was, we can put this in a sort of simple context and say Putin sandbagged Netanyahu. So the UN was previously unable to perform its obligations, which involved patrolling this area, because there was pressure from the US, Israel, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia to not guard the demilitarized zone. Now, the result of a lacking UN presence was that the area was more easily used by Israel to provide safe harbor, arms, equipment, and medical care to Al-Qaeda and ISIS groups under these and several related brands as well. So Russia had been looking for a solution ever since. With the US's waning influence in the region and significantly reduced force projection capacity, we entered into a new period. This had the effect of sending the Zionist entity scrambling in order to seek a better deal, attempting to triangulate US-Russia tensions and the proxy war between the two multipolar powers in the region. Israel has considerable pull on some pillars of Russian power, enough so that it is able to build its move of desperation into the creation of the perception both domestically and internationally that its moves here are proactive and demonstrate an expansion of Israeli power. Whether a line trotted for domestic consumption or international consumption or both, the reality is that Israel trumps that it is not only controlling the US Congress through AIPAC and other deeper mechanisms upon the deep state, such as through banking and through pedophile compromat, but essentially also that the Russian Duma is under its control. A large portion of Israel's population today are also Russian and former Soviet citizens holding 2 passports. In addition, a statistically disproportionate number of Russia's capitalist class are also Israeli citizens. In the grand strategies of nations, it is always beneficial when they're able to shape their major strategic activities in ways that can be read in multiple ways by other strategic actors, with each actor having a generally correct read of the activity. This provides tremendous latitude and ability to act. These can be considered dual-purpose strategies. At the present moment, nowhere is this practice and this condition more visible than with Russia's game with Israel. The biggest news recently was that Russia was set to establish 8 military outposts along the de facto border of Israel and Russia on the Syrian-governed side of the border with the Golan Heights, which is the region, as we just said earlier, which is presently under an illegal occupation. Now here we have a little map of the proposed Russian outposts as we understand them to be, and these sort of create a corridor, a defensive corridor, and people have said that this can work both ways, and that's kind of what we're going to be talking about tonight. For those of you just joining us, welcome. This is the Fort Roos News Radio podcast number 1, issue 1, volume 1. And we're looking at this article about Israel's strategic collapse. Now, this one was fairly popular, and I think we can understand why. You see, through a complex system of information war, Russia is using the very same cordoning off of the internet which the US establishment and deep state are set to complete to disassemble reality. This virtual walled garden is meant to decelerate and frustrate the otherwise natural tendency of the internet towards the cross-pollination and cross-dissemination of ideas. This original internet process of cross-pollination leads inevitably to a quickening of the historic process of the same, and previously the internet increased the rate at which this process occurred, which is inherently destabilizing for the powers that be. As the US is cordoning off the internet into various walled gardens, keeping like with like, it is maintaining a segregative process. And Russia is doing its best responsive maneuver, at least operationalizing the fact of the US established cordon off internet zones. How this works is fairly easy to understand. In some sectors of the internet, Russia is promoted as Israel's greatest ally. In others, the axis of resistance featuring Iran, Iraq, and Hezbollah of Lebanon depicts Russia as an important ally. Both are able to point to certain aspects of the conflict in Syria as evidence of this. This belief creation process, especially through new media and the internet, is a critical part of how simulacra are created in the context of fourth-generation warfare. Beliefs are derived from the internet carry a stronger weight at this time than beliefs drawn from television and radio. This is for many reasons, including the role of peer-to-peer information gathering, and that internet-based information was pre-selected and dug for by the consumer. This lends it a higher degree of value because the people had to go out and find it themselves. Russia has stated publicly that it is interested in both Iran and Israel's strategic interests. How can this be, given that both countries are apparently in a proxy and even recently direct conflict with one another? In deciphering what I call Lavrovese, the language of Russian diplomacy, it must be understood that words have a certain meaning. In terms of Russia's diplomacy, commitments to strategic interests, this doesn't mean as these countries view themselves. In other words, Russia is committed to what it itself believes are Israel and Iran's strategic interests, as opposed to what these two countries publicly state their interests are. In short, Russia is committed to Russia's strategic interests, which do align with the general conception of deconfliction. The idea here is the most balanced compromises that deliver peace as a status quo. Instead of strategic interests, security insurance is a better concept to separate this out from Israel's irredentist goals or Iran's foothold in Lebanon. It is neither a problem nor a criticism to state such. Russia has sandbagged its intentions with regard to Israel, and Israel is taking the bait. Also, there is the fact that Russia is aware that both states, Israel and Iran, engage in a form of demagoguery and rhetorically politicize things beyond what may be the real strategic goal. A war between both countries may not be within either country's strategic interests, given that Israel is a nuclear power and that Iran's conventional response would be similarly effective. So all this rhetoric is in fact about containment, playing to their bases, not about mutual destruction. As it is sometimes understood, each has called for the other. Both Iran and Israel have strategic interests in Iraq, with Israel building strong ties with radical Sunnis in Iraq who despise Iranian Shia's growth of power. In essence, Iraq has become a proxy border between Israel and Iran. The government of Iraq today is increasingly, more than nominally so, supportive of Iran. At the same time, through its parliament and private industry, Israel also has a vested interest in Iraq's natural and mineral resources, oil and water. Moreover, and finally, what Iran and Israel publicly say their strategic interests are may not match up with their own internal designs and discourse with regard to grand strategy and regional hegemony. Both states have benefited from the US-led invasion of Iraq. Recall at the time that both the US handpicked secular moderate government of Shalabi and the Shia resistance led by al-Sadr's al-Mahdi army represented Iranian vested interests in the US's campaign. We can see, for example, here that True News, which I think is a Christian online news portal, I think they're fundamentally a Christian evangelical, and I think they may be Christian Zionist. But what they are doing is approaching it from a scare tactic angle. So even though the information might please some people, they don't intend it to please their base. They want their base, to get their base to be moved into action against Iran. So they if you read what they have here and follow the link that was provided here in the podcast, you can see our article that what True News wrote is that Russia establishes 8 MP outposts on Israeli-Syrian border. And they're saying that Chechen volunteers wearing Russian uniforms will reportedly be working alongside the UNDOF observers in the buffer zone. So we can see that from the reporting that this gives a news angle that would seem to please those following the Russia is allies with Iran part of the internet, even while raising concerns and legal contentions from the point of view of Israel. Here they point out a few facts which tend in the direction that supports their view, such as framing it as a Russian deployment that would prevent Israel from striking at Syrian and Iranian targets on the Syrian-governed side of the Purple Line. The standard reportage went like this, quote, the Russian military police will create 8 outposts near the demilitarized zone at the Golan Heights on the Syrian-Israeli border. A deputy commander of the Russian forces in Syria in charge of the military police, Viktor Zaystev, said, according to the official, the first permanent observation post of the Russian military police has already been set up. 7 more will be created in the future. They will serve as a security guarantee for civilians of the Kunitra governorate. He said another deputy commander of the Russian forces in Syria, Sergei Korolenko, said the outposts will be created near the demilitarized zone, controlled by UN forces. Quote, and this is quite different from the true news source, and this is an official Russian source, quote, I would like to stress that there will be no Russian military police posts in the demilitarized zone, he said. The Golan Heights had been part of Syria since 1944, but the territory was seized by Israel during the 1967 Six-Day War. TASS reported it like this, we see below, denying speculation that Russian outposts would be militarized. Now, these are 2 different lines here, because when you dissect this, he's saying that there will be no Russian military police posts in the demilitarized zone. Is that what they're talking about with regard to the Syrian side of the purple line? Because there's a demilitarized zone on the in between that borders on the Kunitra governorate, but it's a little tricky. What he's saying is that they will be not in the demilitarized zone, but close to the demilitarized zone, because it looks like we have 2 accounts that don't necessarily conflict based upon whether we're saying near or in. So we continue, is that what's interesting here also is that it was a number of years ago that Russia proposed to lead the UN's Blue Helmets mission in the demilitarized zone, or near the demilitarized zone. What's been arrived at appears to be something close to what Russia had originally proposed, indeed perhaps even more so, since the UN may find itself more constricted and its activities controlled by forces hostile to Syrian sovereignty, which may still have been the case with Russian forces entirely embedded as UN forces. At the same time, the Syrian military is growing stronger, and Hezbollah, Iran's best asset in Lebanon and acting in Syria at the invitation of the Syrian government, has also emerged from this conflict with yet another victory, and the experience and morale boost that goes along with this, doubling on the 2006 victory against the entire IDF back in 2006. Israel, no doubt, has had it sold to them by Russia that Russia's activity in the region will prevent a mobilized Syria and its allies especially from taking their campaign to its logical conclusion and pushing back on Israel, retaking some or all of the Golan Heights. Israel has certainly provoked this with their active involvement in backing foreign terrorists and rebels in the Syrian conflict. That Israel has used the Golan Heights and the adjacent parts of what has been recognized as Damascus-governed Syria, though even when under FSA or ISIS control, that they have armed and provided cover for ISIS and al-Nusra. This is a significant enough pretext for Syria to have a legitimate reason to take their forward momentum and rebuilt military into a limited conflict to make new facts on the ground. Israel's military was proven to be a decidedly weak force back in 2006 when it was defeated by Hezbollah, the paramilitary wing of the Hezbollah Party of Lebanon, not even a conventional force, not having the entire resources of a state behind it. Additionally, the much vaunted Israeli Air Force, when really broken down by fighter and bomber type, generation, and the number of units, is significantly outdated and weaker in comparison to its claims, and when compared to that of Iran, is perhaps even the lesser force. For what it's worth, and certainly given that Wikipedia's owners, pro-Zionism, and the propensity of Zionist media to inflate Israel's projection capacity, this is a clue to understanding anti-Semitism, incidentally. Even these following numbers, which show that Iran has a clear conventional strategic advantage over Israel, are difficult to dispute. Take these two with the fact that the S-200 and S-250 systems that Syria has were sufficient to down Israeli bombers. So we can just take a quick look here and see what Israel has. It looks like it has only 19 F-15s, another 25 of the F-15Es. It's got a number of the F-16 Fighting Falcon. It looks like it has about between 49 and 97, depending on what its classification is. It looks like it has C, D, and I, 78, 49, and 97. It has 12 of the F-36 Lightning II. We won't go through the whole list here, but you can take a quick look when scan with your eyes. Those of you who know your aircraft will know what the comparable Russian or international rivals are to these, and know how limited, for example, some of these are. And those who understand the relationship between the pitching versus batting game in baseball would know that the offensive capacity and the defensive capacity are two different places in their historical development. They're just really not comparable at all. Latest generation American bomber, for example, is going to get taken out by an S-300 in many in many instances. It's just where the technology is at right now. You don't need the S-400. You don't need the latest generation defensive SAM to take out the latest generation American fighter or bomber. Looking just quickly at the Iranian force, you can see that it has a good number of MiG-29s. It has the Sukhoi Su-24s, Su-22s. It actually has a good number of some of these fighters. Just food for thought there. They're not missing an air force. All of this also makes sense with an understanding of one of Zionism's weapons, the illusion of strength and the illusion of being under attack. Aggression postured as defense has been, like the US, Israel's main propaganda weapon to justify its expansionist policy against its neighbors. Now is a critical time for Israel, given that the US's decreased role as the sole foreign hegemon in the region. Turkey is active, and while not acting in any interest of it but its own, now also acts at odds with the US. Iran emerges from the Syrian conflict in better shape overall militarily. The sanctions on Iran have split Europe from the US, as the former is sticking to a deal which sees Iran emerge as a normalized trading partner with the EU. This has the effect of increasing the tensions and the trade war between the US and EU. This same trade war also has the effect of pushing the EU closer to Russia and China as a result. Through all of this, Russia masterfully manipulates Israel's Zionist mythos, embodied in Netanyahu as a cunning juggernaut of strategy, being able to middle itself between the US and Russia, hedging its bets and investing reliance on its security into Russian positions, even those in the Golan Heights. Media can work both ways, towards opposing ends, regardless of the apparent editorial line. Media, which plays up danger to Israel, can also strengthen Zionism as a threatened democracy and underdog, a shining light in a sea of growing Islamism, regardless of sectarian distinction. Media that plays up Israel's success in playing Israel and the US feeds into anti-Semitism, presenting Israel as representative of world Jewry, a claim that the Jewish state makes of itself, which in turn Zionism requires as oxygen. The state of Israel, outside of esoteric and religious context of a burnt offering and the subsequent rebuilding of the temple, is legitimized almost entirely upon the precept of anti-Semitism and its historic consequences. It is one of the few states in the world today which has established its right to exist upon an ongoing and permanent existential threat to those who identify as its people. At the same time, there lies a significant problem in that Netanyahu has platformed himself as a strongman, and in so sandbagging as a state in jeopardy doesn't fit very well with this winning strategy in the domestic, electoral, and international diplomatic stage. Israel has indeed overplayed its hand, believing it would be able to influence both US and Russian foreign policy in a region towards its aims. Israel has failed to ensnare the US in an overcommitment in Syria, the Lavrov-Kerry deconfliction talks were ultimately preparatory for the US's surrender in that conflict in general. Reading this correctly, Israel moved to push on its nevertheless impressive human and financial capital influence in Russia, giving Netanyahu the false assurance that such a strategy was possible. While some, both in Russia and Israeli media sphere, will report on the deployment of Russian soldiers to the Golan Heights region as being a sign of Russia's commitment to ensuring Israel's strategic interests, rather it does so in a very different way, ensuring Israel's security from its own misleadership in the image of Netanyahu. And that has been our reading and discussion of our article, Israel's Strategic Collapse, How Putin Sandbagged Netanyahu. And this has been an experimental live run of issue 1, volume 1, broadcast number 1 of FRN's live streaming podcast. Now, we may take this very shortly in the coming future directly to YouTube or other platforms, and we may change or not do a live version. But what we will do absolutely is continue the podcast format, and we will expand it to include guests, other speakers, and so on. We have so much material. There is so much happening in this world right now that it is literally something that has to be followed. And we have found that reading articles can be difficult, and at the same time, video-reliant material, while having its strengths, are not necessarily the thing that people take with them when they're on the go. Now, I think that's changed a lot with the predominance of smartphones. We're looking at different technological angles here, what capacity we have. It certainly is not easy to organize such a thing and do it regularly on top of many different obligations that are ongoing. Nevertheless, in keeping up with readers and users' interests and demands, it is absolutely necessary that we engage in this type of format. And I think that what we'll be doing is we will keep it regular, and we will find articles, and ultimately we will set it up so that we can take calls or messages from people, or we will have different types of guests on, and we will pre-record and play it like that. At any rate, this is Joaquin Flores for Fort Ruth News. We have been live today. We will upload this to our YouTube. It'll also be here on Facebook on the Fort Ruth News page if it doesn't get shut down. We've got to fight against the censorship. We have to push back. There is no going home. There is no giving up. When the empire pushes, you just have to push back, and there is no two ways about that. So thank you all, and have a great rest of the day.